Chapter 21. Desert castaways. The backtrack. A hideout. The wind takes a side. The judge returns. An address. Los Digueños. San Felipe. Hospitality of the savages. Into the mountains. Grizzlies. San Diego. The sea. The kid looked at Tobin, but the ex-priest sat without expression. He was drawn and wretched looking, and the approaching travelers seemed to evoke in him no recognition. He raised his head slightly and he spoke without looking at the kid. "Go on," he said. "Save yourself." The kid took the water bottle from the shales and unstoppered it and drank and handed it across. The ex-priest drank, and they sat watching, and then they rose and turned and set out again. They were much reduced by their wounds and their hunger, and they made a poor show as they staggered onward. By noon their water was gone, and they sat studying the barrenness about. A wind blew down from the north. Their mouths were dry. The desert upon which they were entrained was desert absolute, and it was devoid of feature altogether, and there was nothing to mark their progress upon it. The earth fell away on every side equally in its architecture, and by these limits were they circumscribed, and of them were they locusts. They rose and went on. The sky was luminous. There was no trace to follow other than the bits of cast-off left by travelers, even to the bones of men drifted out of their graves in the scalloped sands. In the afternoon, the terrain began to rise before them, and at the crest of a shallow esker they stood and looked back to see the judge, much as before, some 2 miles distant on the plain. They went on. The approach to any watering place in that desert was marked by the carcasses of perished animals in increasing number, and so it was now, as if the wells were ringed about by some hazard lethal to creatures. The travelers looked back. The judge was out of sight beyond the rise. Before them lay the whitened boards of a wagon, and further on the shapes of mule and ox, with the hides scoured bald as canvas by the constant abrasion of the sand. The kid stood studying this place, and then he backtracked some 100 yards and stood looking down at his shallow footprints in the sand. He looked upon the drifted slope of the esker which they had descended, and he knelt and held his hand against the ground, and he listened to the faint silica hiss of the wind. When he lifted his hand, there was a thin ridge of sand that had drifted against it, and he watched this ridge slowly vanish before him. The ex-priest, when he returned to him, presented a grave appearance. The kid knelt and studied him where he sat. "We gotta hide," he said. "Hide?" "Yes." "Where do you aim to hide?" "Here. We'll hide here." "You can't hide, lad." "We can hide." "You think he can't follow your track?" "The wind's taking it. It's gone from the slope yonder." "Gone?" "Every trace." The ex-priest shook his head. "Come on, we gotta get going." "You can't hide." "Get up." The ex-priest shook his head. "Ah, lad," he said. "Get up," said the kid. "Go on, go on." He waved his hand. The kid spoke to him. "He ain't nothing. You told me so yourself. Men are made of the dust of the earth. You said it was no parable. No parable. That it was a naked fact, and the judge was a man like all men. Face him down, then, said the ex-priest. Face him down if he is so. And him with a rifle, and me with a pistol? Him with 2 rifles? Get up from there. Tobin rose. He stood unsteadily. He leaned against the kid. They set out, veering off from the drifted track and down past the wagon. They passed the first of the racks of bones and went on to where a pair of mules lay dead in the traces. And here the kid knelt with a piece of board and began to scoop them a shelter, watching the skyline to the east as he worked. Then they lay prone in the lee of those sour bones like sated scavengers, and awaited the arrival of the judge and the passing of the judge, if he would so pass. They'd not long to wait. He appeared upon the rise and paused momentarily before starting down, he and his drooling mansible. The ground before him was drifted and rolling, and although it could be fairly reconnoitered from the rise, the judge did not scan the country, nor did he seem to miss the fugitives from his purview. He descended the ridge and started across the flats, the idiot before him on a leather lead. He carried the 2 rifles that had belonged to Brown, and he wore a pair of canteens crossed upon his chest, and he carried a powder horn and flask, and his portmanteau, and a canvas rucksack that must have belonged to Brown also. More strangely, he carried a parasol made from rotted scraps of hide stretched over a framework of rib bones, bound with strips of tug. The handle had been the foreleg of some creature, and the judge approaching was clothed in little more than confetti, so rent was his costume to accommodate his figure. Bearing before him that morbid umbrella with the idiot in its rawhide collar pulling at the lead, he seemed some degenerate entrepreneur fleeing from a medicine show and the outrage of the citizens who'd sacked it. They advanced across the flats, and the kid on his belly in the sand wallow watched them through the ribs of the dead mules. He could see his own tracks and Tobin's coming across the sand, dim and rounded, but tracks for that. And he watched the judge, and he watched the tracks, and he listened to the sand moving on the desert floor. The judge was perhaps 100 yards out when he stopped and surveyed the ground. The idiot squatted on all fours and leaned into the lead like some naked species of lemur. It swung its head and sniffed at the air as if it were being used for tracking. It had lost its hat, or perhaps the judge had replevened it, for he now wore a rough and curious pair of pampooties cut from a piece of hide and strapped to the soles of his feet with wrappings of hemp salvaged from some desert wreck. The imbecile lunged in its collar and croaked, its forearms dangling at its chest. When they passed the wagon and continued on, the kid knew they were beyond the point where he and Tobin had turned off from the trace. He looked at the tracks, faint shapes that backed across the sands and vanished. The ex-priest at his side seized his arm and hissed and gestured toward the passing judge, and the wind rattled the scraps of hide at the carcass, and the judge and the idiot passed on across the sands and disappeared from sight. They lay without speaking. The ex-priest raised himself slightly and looked out, and he looked at the kid. The kid lowered the hammer of the pistol. "You'll get no such chance as that again." The kid put the pistol in his belt and rose onto his knees and looked out. "And what now?" The kid didn't answer. "He'll be waiting at the next well." "Let him wait. We could go back to the creek." "And do what?" "Wait for a party to come through." "Through from where? There ain't no ferry." "There's game comes to the creek." Tobin was looking out through the bones and hide. When the kid didn't answer, he looked up. "We could go there," he said. "I got 4 rounds," the kid said. He rose and looked out across the scavenged ground, and the ex-priest rose and looked with him. What they saw was the judge returning. The kid swore and dropped to his belly. The ex-priest crouched. They pushed down into the wallow, and with their chins in the sand like lizards, they watched the judge traverse again the grounds before them. With his leashed fool and his equipage, and the parasol dripping in the wind like a great black flower, he passed among the wreckage until he was again upon the slope of the sand esker. At the crest he turned, and the imbecile squatted at his knees, and the judge lowered the parasol before him and addressed the countryside about. "The priest has led you to this, boy. I know you would not hide. I know, too, that you've not the heart of a common assassin. I passed before your gun sights twice this hour, and will pass a 3rd time. Why not show yourself?" "No assassin," called the judge, "and no partisan either. There's a flawed place in the fabric of your heart. Do you think I could not know? You alone were mutinous. You alone reserved in your soul some corner of clemency for the heathen." The imbecile stood and raised its hands to its face and yammered weirdly, and sat again. "You think I've killed Brown and Toadvine? They are alive as you and me. They are alive and in possession of the fruits of their election. Do you understand? Ask the priest. The priest knows. The priest does not lie." The judge raised the parasol and adjusted his parcels. "Perhaps," he called, "perhaps you have seen this place in a dream, that you would die here." Then he descended the esker and passed once more across the boneyard, led by the tethered fool, until the two were shimmering and insubstantial in the waves of heat, and then they were gone altogether. They would have died if the Indians had not found them. All the early part of the night they'd kept Sirius at their left on the southwest horizon, and Cetus out there fording the void, and Orion and Betelgeuse turning overhead, and they had slept curled and shivering in the darkness of the plains, and woke to find the heavens all changed, and the stars by which they'd traveled not to be found, as if their sleep had encompassed whole seasons. In the auburn dawn, they saw the half-naked savages crouched or standing all in a row along a rise to the north. They got up and went on, their shadows so long and so narrow, raising with mock stealth each thin articulated leg. The mountains to the west were whited out against the daybreak. The Aborigines moved along the sand ridge. After a while, the ex-priest sat down, and the kid stood over him with the pistol, and the savages came down from the dunes and approached by starts and checks across the plain like painted sprites. They were digenuous. They were armed with short bows, and they drew about the travelers and knelt and gave them water out of a gourd. They'd seen such pilgrims before, and with sufferings more terrible. They eked a desperate living from that land, and they knew that nothing excepting some savage pursuit could drive men to such plight. And they watched each day for that thing to gather itself out of its terrible incubation in the house of the sun and muster along the edge of the eastern world, and whether it be armies or plague or pestilence or something altogether unspeakable, they waited with a strange equanimity. They led the refugees into their camp at San Felipe, a collection of crude huts made from reeds and housing a population of filthy and beggarly creatures dressed largely in the cotton shirts of the Argonauts who'd passed there. Shirts and nothing more. They fetched them a stew of lizards and pocket mice, hot in clay bowls, and a sort of pignoli made from dried and pounded grasshoppers. And they crouched about and watched them with great solemnity as they ate. One reached and touched the grips of the pistol in the kid's belt and drew back again. "Pistola," he said. The kid ate. The savages nodded. "Quiero mirar su pistola," the man said. The kid didn't answer. When the man reached for the pistol, he intercepted his hand and put it from him. When he turned loose, the man reached again, and the kid pushed his hand away again. The man grinned. He reached a third time. The kid set the bowl between his legs and drew the pistol and cocked it and put the muzzle against the man's forehead. They sat quite still. The others watched. After a while, the kid lowered the pistol and let down the hammer and put it in his belt and picked up the bowl and commenced eating again. The man gestured toward the pistol and spoke to his friends, and they nodded, and then they sat as before. "¿Qué pasó con ustedes?" The kid watched the man over the rim of the bowl with his dark and hollow eyes. The Indian looked at the ex-priest. "¿Qué pasó con ustedes?" The ex-priest in his black and crusted cravat turned his whole torso to look at the man who'd spoken. He looked at the kid. He'd been eating with his fingers, and he licked them and wiped them on the filthy leg of his trousers. "Las yumas," he said. They sucked in air and clucked their tongues. "Son muy malos," said the speaker. "Claro. ¿No tiene compañeros?" The kid and the ex-priest eyed each other. "Sí," said the kid. "Muchos." He waved his hand to the east. "Llegarán. Muchos compañeros." The Indians received this news without expression. A woman brought more of the pignoli, but they had been without food too long to have appetites, and they waved her away. In the afternoon, they bathed in the creek and slept on the ground. When they woke, they were being watched by a group of naked children and a few dogs. When they went up through the camp, they saw the Indians sitting along a ledge of rock, watching tirelessly the land to the east for whatever might come out of it. No one spoke to them of the judge, and they didn't ask. The dogs and children followed them out of the camp, and they took the trail up into the low hills to the west, where the sun was already going. They reached Warner's ranch late the following day, and they restored themselves at the hot sulfur springs there. There was no one about. They moved on. The country to the west was rolling and grassy, and beyond were mountains running to the coast. They slept that night among dwarf cedars, and in the morning the grass was frozen. And they could hear the wind in the frozen grass, and they could hear the cries of birds that seemed a charm against the sullen shores of the void out of which they had ascended. All that day they climbed through a highland park forested with Joshua trees and rimmed about by bald granite peaks. In the evening, flocks of eagles went up through the pass before them, and they could see on those grassy benches the great shambling figures of bears, like cattle, grazing on some upland heath. There were skifts of snow in the lee of the stone ledges, and in the night a light snow fell upon them. Reefs of mist were blowing across the slopes when they set out shivering in the dawn, and in the new snow they saw the tracks of the bears that had come down to take their wind just before daylight. That day there was no sun, only a paleness in the haze, and the country was white with frost, and the shrubs were like polar isomers of their own shapes. Wild rams ghosted away up those rocky draws, and the wind swirled down cold and gray from the snowy reeks above them, a smoking region of wild vapors blowing down through the gap as if the world up there were all afire. They spoke less and less between them until at last they were silent altogether, as is often the way with travelers approaching the end of a journey. They drank from the cold mountain streams and bathed their wounds, and they shot a young doe at a spring and ate what they could and smoked thin sheets of the meat to carry with them. Although they saw no more bears, they saw sign of their vicinity, and they moved off over the slopes a good mile from their meat camp before they put down for the night. In the morning, they crossed a bed of thunderstones clustered on that heath like the ossified eggs of some primal ground bird. They trod the shadow line under the mountains, keeping just in the sun for the warmth of it. And that afternoon, they first saw the sea, far below them, blue and serene under clouds. The trail went down through the low hills and picked up the wagon track, and they followed where the locked wheels had skidded and the iron tires scarred the rock, and the sea down there darkened to black, and the sun fell, and all the land about went blue and cold. They slept shivering under a wooded boss among owl cries and a scent of juniper, while the stars swarmed in the bottomless night. It was evening of the following day when they entered San Diego. The ex-priest turned off to find them a doctor, but the kid wandered on through the raw mud streets and out past the houses of hide in their rows and across the gravel strand to the beach. Loose strands of amber-colored kelp lay in a rubbery rack at the tide line. A dead seal. Beyond the inner bay, part of a reef in a thin line, like something foundered there on which the sea was teething. He squatted in the sand and watched the sun on the hammered face of the water. Out there, island clouds emplaned upon a salmon-colored other sea. Seafowl in silhouette. Downshore, the dull surf boomed. There was a horse standing there, staring out upon the darkening waters, and a young colt that cavorted and trotted off and came back. He sat watching while the sun dipped, hissing in the swells. The horse stood darkly against the sky. The surf boomed in the dark, and the sea's black hide heaved in the cobbled starlight, and the long pale combers loped out of the night and broke along the beach. He rose and turned toward the lights of the town. The tide pools, bright as smelter pots among the dark rocks where the phosphorescent sea crabs clambered back. Passing through the salt grass, he looked back. The horse hadn't moved. A ship's light winked in the swells. The colt stood against the horse with its head down, and the horse was watching out there past men's knowing, where the stars are drowning and whales ferry their vast souls through the black and seamless sea. Chapter 22. Under arrest. The judge pays a call. An arraignment. Soldier, priest, magistrate. On his own recognizance. He sees a surgeon. The arrow shaft removed from his leg. Delirium. He journeys to Los Angeles. A public hanging. Los Ahorcados. Looking for the ex-priest. Another fool. The scapular. to Sacramento, a traveler in the West. He abandons his party. The Penitent Brothers, the Death Cart, another massacre, the Eldris in the rocks. Going back through the streets past the yellow window lights and barking dogs, he encountered a detachment of soldiers, but they took him for an older man in the dark and passed on. He entered a tavern and sat in a darkened corner watching the groups of men at the tables. No one asked him what he wanted in that place. He seemed to be waiting for someone to come for him, and after a while, 4 soldiers entered and arrested him. They didn't even ask his name. In his cell, he began to speak with a strange urgency of things few men have seen in a lifetime, and his jailer said that his mind had become uncottered by the acts of blood in which he had participated. One morning he woke to find the judge standing at his cage, hat in hand, smiling down at him. He was dressed in a suit of gray linen, and he wore new polished boots. His coat was unbuttoned, and in his waistcoat he carried a watch chain and a stick pin, and in his belt a leather-covered clip that held a small silver-mounted derringer stocked in rosewood. He looked down the hallway of the crude mud building and donned the hat and smiled again at the prisoner. "Well," he said, "how are you?" The kid didn't answer. "They wanted to know from me if you were always crazy," said the judge. "They said it was the country. The country turned them out." "Where's Tobin?" "I told them that the Cretan had been a respected doctor of divinity from Harvard College as recently as March of this year, that his wits had stood him as far west as the Aquarius Mountains. It was the ensuing country that carried them off, together with his clothes." "And Toadvine and Brown, where are they?" "In the desert, where you left them. A cruel thing. Your companions in arms." The judge shook his head. "What do they aim to do with me?" "I believe it is their intention to hang you."
"What did you tell them?"
"Told them the truth, that you were the person responsible. Not that we have all the details, but they understand that it was you and none other who shaped events along such a calamitous course, eventuating in the massacre at the ford by the savages with whom you conspired. Means and ends are of little moment here, idle speculations. But even though you carry the draft of your murderous plan with you to the grave, it will nonetheless be known in all its infamy to your Maker. And as that is so, so shall it be made known to the least of men, all in the fullness of time."
"You're the one that's crazy,"
said the kid. The judge smiled. "No," he said, "it was never me. But why lurk there in the shadows? Come here, where we can talk, you and me." The kid stood against the far wall, hardly more than a shadow himself. "Come up," said the judge. "Come up, for I've yet more to tell you." He looked down the hallway. "Don't be afraid," he said. "I'll speak softly. It's not for the world's ears, but for yours only. Let me see you. Don't you know that I'd have loved you like a son?" He reached through the bars. "Come here," he said. "Let me touch you." The kid stood with his back to the wall. "Come here, if you're not afraid," whispered the judge.
"I ain't afraid of you."
The judge smiled. He spoke softly into the dim mud cubicle. You came forward, he said, to take part in a work. But you were a witness against yourself. You sat in judgment on your own deeds. You put your own allowances before the judgments of history, and you broke with the body of which you were pledged a part, and poisoned it in all its enterprise. Hear me, man. I spoke in the desert for you, and you only, and you turned a deaf ear to me. If war is not holy, man is nothing but anti-clay. Even the Cretan acted in good faith according to his parts. For it was required of no man to give more than he possessed, nor was any man's share compared to another's. Only each was called upon to empty out his heart into the common, and one did not. Can you tell me who that one was?
It was you,
whispered the kid.
You were the one.
The judge watched him through the bars. He shook his head. What joins men together, he said, is not the sharing of bread, but the sharing of enemies. But if I was your enemy, with whom would you have shared me? With whom? The priest? Where is he now? Look at me. Our animosities were formed and waiting before ever we two met. Yet even so, you could have changed it all.
You, said the kid. It was you.
It was never me, said the judge. Listen to me. Do you think Glanton was a fool? Don't you know that he'd have killed you?
Lies, the kid said. Lies, by God, lies.
Think again, said the judge.
He never took part in your craziness.
The judge smiled. He took his watch from his waistcoat and opened it and held it to the failing light. For even if you should have stood your ground, he said, yet what ground was it? He looked up. He pressed the case shut and restored the instrument to his person. Time to be going, he said. I have errands. The kid closed his eyes. When he opened them, the judge was gone. That night he called the corporal to him, and they sat on either side of the bars while the kid told the soldier of the hoard of gold and silver coins hid in the mountains not far from this place. He talked for a long time. The corporal had set the candle on the floor between them, and he watched him as one might watch a glib and lying child. When he was finished, the corporal rose and took the candle with him, leaving him in darkness. He was released 2 days later. A Spanish priest had come to baptize him and had flung water at him through the bars like a priest casting out spirits. An hour later, when they came for him, he grew giddy with fear. He was taken before the alcalde, and this man spoke to him in a fatherly manner in the Spanish language, and then he was turned out into the streets. The doctor that he found was a young man of good family from the East. He cut open his trouser leg with scissors and looked at the blackened shaft of the arrow and moved it about. A soft fistula had formed about it. "Do you have any pain?" he said. The kid didn't answer. He pressed about the wound with his thumb. He said that he could perform the surgery and that it would cost $100. The kid rose from the table and limped out. The day following, as he sat on the plaza, a boy came and led him again to the shack behind the hotel, and the doctor told him that they would operate in the morning. He sold the pistol to an Englishman for $40 and woke at dawn in a lot underneath some boards where he'd crawled in the night. It was raining, and he went down through the empty mud streets and hammered at the grocer's door until the man let him in. When he appeared at the surgeon's office, he was very drunk, holding onto the door jamb, a quart bottle half full of whiskey clutched in his hand. The surgeon's assistant was a student from Sinaloa who had apprenticed himself here. An altercation ensued at the door until the surgeon himself came from the rear of the premises. "You'll have to come back tomorrow," he said.
I don't aim to be no soberer then.
The surgeon studied him. "All right," he said. "Let me have the whiskey." He entered, and the apprentice shut the door behind him. "You won't need the whiskey," said the doctor. "Let me have it."
Why won't I need it?
"We have spirits of ether. You won't need the whiskey."
Is it stronger?
"Much stronger. In any case, I can't operate on a man and him dead drunk." He looked at the assistant, and then he looked at the surgeon. He set the bottle on the table. "Good," said the surgeon. "I want you to go with Marcello. He will draw you a bath and give you clean linen and show you to a bed." He pulled his watch from his vest and held it in his palm and read it. "It is 8:15. We'll operate at 1. Get some rest. If you require anything, please let us know." The assistant led him across the courtyard to a whitewashed adobe building in the rear. A bay that held 4 iron beds, all empty. He bathed in a large riveted copper boiler that looked to have been salvaged from a ship, and he lay on the rough mattress and listened to children playing somewhere beyond the wall. He did not sleep. When they came for him, he was still drunk. He was led out and laid on a trestle in an empty room adjoining the bay, and the assistant pressed an icy cloth to his nose and told him to breathe deeply. In that sleep, and in sleeps to follow, the judge did visit. Who would come other? A great shambling mutant, silent and serene. Whatever his antecedents, he was something wholly other than their sum. Nor was there system by which to divide him back into his origins, for he would not go. Whoever would seek out his history through what unraveling of loins and ledger books must stand at last darkened and dumb at the shore of a void without terminus or origin. And whatever science he might bring to bear upon the dusty primal matter blowing down out of the millennia will discover no trace of any ultimate atavistic egg by which to reckon his commencing. In the white and empty room he stood in his bespoken suit with his hat in his hand, and he peered down with his small and lashless pig's eyes, wherein this child, just 16 years on earth, could read whole bodies of decisions not accountable to the courts of men. And he saw his own name, which nowhere else could he have ciphered out at all, logged into the records as a thing already accomplished. A traveler known in jurisdictions existing only in the claims of certain pensioners or on old dated maps. In his delirium he ransacked the linens of his pallet for arms, but there were none. The judge smiled. The fool was no longer there, but another man. And this other man he could never see in his entirety, but he seemed an artisan and a worker in metal. The judge enshadowed him where he crouched at his tray, but he was a cold forger who worked with hammer and die, perhaps under some indictment, and an exile from men's fires, hammering out like his own conjectural destiny all through the night of his becoming some coinage for a dawn that would not be. It is this false moneyer, with his gravers and burins, who seeks favor with the judge. And he is contriving from cold slag, brute in the crucible, a face that will pass, an image that will render this residual species current in the markets where men barter. Of this is the judge, and the night does not end. The light in the room altered, a door closed. He opened his eyes. His leg was swathed in sheeting, and it was propped up with small rolls of reed matting. He was desperate with thirst, and his head was booming, and his leg was like an evil visitant in the bed with him, such was the pain. By and by the assistant came with water for him. He did not sleep again. The water that he drank ran out through his skin and drenched the bedding, and he lay without moving, as if to outwit the pain, and his face was gray and drawn, and his long hair damp and matted. A week more, and he was hobbling through the town on crutches provided him by the surgeon. He inquired at every door for news of the ex-priest, but no one knew him. In June of that year, he was in Los Angeles, quartered in a hostel that was no more than a common doss house, he and 40 other men of every nationality. On the morning of the 11th, all rose up still in darkness and turned out to witness a public hanging at the castle. When he arrived, it was paling light, and already such a horde of spectators at the gate that he could not well see the proceedings. He stood at the edge of the crowd while day broke and speeches were said. Then, abruptly, 2 bound figures rose vertically from among their fellows to the top of the gatehouse, and there they hung, and there they died. Bottles were handed about, and the witnesses who had stood in silence began to talk again. In the evening, when he returned to that place, there was no one there at all. A guard leaned in the gatehouse portal chewing tobacco, and the hanged men at their rope ends looked like effigies for to frighten birds. As he drew near, he saw that it was Toadvine and Brown. He'd little money, and then he'd none. But he was in every dram house and gaming room, every cockpit and doggery. A quiet youth in a suit too large, and the same broken boots he'd come off the desert in. Standing just within the door of a foul saloon, with his eyes shifting under the brim of the hat he wore, and the light from a wall sconce on the side of his face, he was taken for a male whore, and set up to drink, and then shown to the rear of the premises. He left his patron senseless in a mudroom where there was no light. Other men found him on their own sordid missions, and other men took his purse and watch. Later still, someone took his shoes. He heard no news of the priest, and he'd quit asking. Returning to his lodgings one morning at daybreak in a gray rain, he saw a face slobbering in an upper window, and he climbed the stairwell and rapped at the door. A woman in a silk kimono opened the door and looked out at him. Behind her in the room, a candle burned at a table, and in the pale light at the window, a half-wit sat in a pen with a cat. It turned to look at him. Not the judge's fool, but just some other fool. When the woman asked him what he wanted, he turned without speaking and descended the stairwell into the rain and the mud in the street. With his last $2, he bought from a soldier the scapular of heathen ears that Brown had worn to the scaffold. He was wearing them the next morning when he hired out to an independent conductor from the state of Missouri, and he was wearing them when they set out for Fremont on the Sacramento River with a train of wagons and pack animals. If the conductor had any curiosity about the necklace, he kept it to himself. He was at this employment for some months, and he left it without notice. He traveled about from place to place. He didn't avoid the company of other men. He was treated with a certain deference, as one who had got onto terms with life beyond what his years could account for. By now he'd come by a horse and a revolver, the rudiments of an outfit. He worked at different trades. He had a Bible that he'd found at the mining camps, and he carried this book with him, no word of which could he read. In his dark and frugal clothes, some took him for a sort of preacher, but he was no witness to them, neither of things at hand nor things to come, he least of any man. They were remote places for news that he traveled in, and in those uncertain times men toasted the ascension of rulers already deposed, and hailed the coronation of kings murdered and in their graves. Of such corporal histories, even as these, he bore no tidings. And although it was the custom in that wilderness to stop with any traveler and exchange the news, he seemed to travel with no news at all, as if the doings of the world were too slanderous for him to truck with, or perhaps too trivial. He saw men killed with guns and with knives and with ropes, and he saw women fought over to the death whose value they themselves set at $2. He saw ships from the land of China chained in the small harbors, and bales of tea and silks and spices broken open with swords by small yellow men with speech like cats. On that lonely coast where the steep rocks cradled a dark and muttersome sea, he saw vultures at their soaring, whose wingspans so dwarfed all lesser birds that the eagles shrieking underneath were more like terns or plovers. He saw piles of gold a hat would scarcely have covered, wagered on the turn of a card and lost. And he saw bears and lions turned loose in pits to fight wild bulls to the death. And he was twice in the city of San Francisco, and twice saw it burn, and never went back, riding out on horseback along the road to the south, where all night the shape of the city burned against the sky, and burned again in the black waters of the sea, where dolphins rolled through the flames, fire in the lake, through the fall of burning timbers and the cries of the lost. He never saw the ex-priest again. Of the judge, he heard rumor everywhere. In the spring of his 28th year, he set out with others upon the desert to the east. He, one of 5 at hire, to see a party through the wilderness to their homes halfway across the continent. 7 days from the coast at a desert well, he left them. They were just a band of pilgrims returning to their homes, men and women already dusty and travel-worn. He set the horse's face north toward the stone mountains running thinly under the edge of the sky, and he rode the stars down and the sun up. It was no country he had ever seen, and there was no track to follow into those mountains, and there was no track out. Yet in the deepest fastness of those rocks, he met with men who seemed unable to abide the silence of the world. He first saw them laboring over the plain in the dusk, among flowering ocotillo that burned in the final light like horned candelabra. They were led by a pitero piping a reed, and then in procession a clanging of tambourines and matracas, and men naked to the waist in black capes and hoods, who flailed themselves with whips of braided yucca, and men who bore on their naked backs great loads of chola, and a man tied to a rope who was pulled this way and that by his companions, and a hooded man in a white robe who bore a heavy wooden cross on his shoulders. They were, all of them, barefoot, and they left a trail of blood across the rocks, and they were followed by a rude carreta in which sat a carved wooden skeleton who rattled along stiffly, holding before him a bow and arrow. He shared his cart with a load of stones, and they went trundling over the rocks, drawn by ropes tied to the heads and ankles of the bearers, and accompanied by a deputation of women who carried small desert flowers in their folded hands, or torches of sotol, or primitive lanterns of pierced tin. This troubled sect traversed slowly the ground under the bluff where the watchers stood, and made their way over the broken scree of a fan washed out of the draw above them. And wailing and piping and clanging, they passed between the granite walls into the upper valley, and disappeared in the coming darkness like heralds of some unspeakable calamity, leaving only bloody footprints on the stone. He bivouacked in a barren swale, and he and the horse lay down together, and all night the dry wind blew down the desert, and the wind was all but silent, for there was nothing of resonance among those rocks. In the dawn, he and the horse stood watching the east where the light commenced, and then he saddled the horse and led it down a scrabbled trail through a canyon where he found a tank deep under a pitch of boulders. The water lay in darkness, and the stones were cool, and he drank and fetched water for the horse in his hat. Then he led the animal up onto the ridge, and they went on, the man watching the tableland to the south and the mountains to the north, and the horse clattering along behind. By and by the horse began to toss its head, and soon it would not go. He stood holding the hackamore and studying the country. Then he saw the pilgrims. They were scattered about below him in a stone coulee, dead in their blood. He took down his rifle and squatted and listened. He led the horse under the shade of the rock wall and hobbled it and moved along the rock and down the slope. The company of penitents lay hacked and butchered among the stones in every attitude. Many lay about the fallen cross, and some were mutilated, and some were without heads. Perhaps they'd gathered under the cross for shelter, but the hole into which it had been set, and the cairn of rocks about its base, showed how it had been pushed over, and how the hooded altar Christ had been cut down and disemboweled, who now lay with the scraps of rope by which he had been bound still tied about his wrists and ankles. The kid rose and looked about at this desolate scene, and then he saw, alone and upright in a small niche in the rocks, an old woman kneeling in a faded rebozo with her eyes cast down. He made his way among the corpses and stood before her. She was very old, and her face was gray and leathery, and sand had collected in the folds of her clothing. She did not look up. The shawl that covered her head was much faded of its color, yet it bore, like a patent woven into the fabric, the figures of stars and quarter moons and other insignia of a provenance unknown to him. He spoke to her in a low voice. He told her that he was an American, and that he was a long way from the country of his birth, and that he had no family, and that he had traveled much and seen many things, and had been at war and endured hardships. He told her that he would convey her to a safe place, some party of her country people who would welcome her, and that she should join them, for he could not leave her in this place, or she would surely die. He knelt on one knee, resting the rifle before him like a staff. "Abuelita," he said, "no puedes escucharme?" He reached into the little cove and touched her arm. She moved slightly, her whole body, light and rigid. She weighed nothing. She was just a dried shell, and she had been dead in that place for years. Chapter 23. On the North Texas plains, an old buffalo hunter, the millennial herds, the bone pickers, night on the prairie, the callers, Apache ears. Elrod takes a stand, a killing, bearing off the dead. Fort Griffin, the beehive, A stage show. The judge. Killing a bear. The judge speaks of old times. In preparation for the dance. The judge on war, destiny, the supremacy of man. The dance hall. The whore. The Jakes and what was encountered there. Sie müssen schlafen, aber ich muss tanzen. In the late winter of 1878, he was on the plains of North Texas. He crossed the double mountain fork of the Brazos River on a morning when skim ice lay along the sandy shore, and he rode through a dark dwarf forest of black and twisted mesquite trees. He made his camp that night on a piece of high ground where there was a windbreak formed of a tree felled by lightning. He'd no sooner got his fire to burn than he saw across the prairie in the darkness another fire. Like his, it twisted in the wind. Like his, it warmed one man alone. It was an old hunter in camp, and the hunter shared tobacco with him and told him of the buffalo and the stands he'd made against them, laid up in a sag on some rise with the dead animals scattered over the grounds, and the herd beginning to mill, and the rifle barrels so hot the wiping patches sizzled in the bore, and the animals by the thousands and tens of thousands, and the hides pegged out over actual square miles of ground, and the teams of skinners spelling one another around the clock, and the shooting and shooting weeks and months till the bore shot slick and the stock shot loose at the tang, and their shoulders were yellow and blue to the elbow, and the tandem wagons groaned away over the prairie 20 and 22 ox teams, and the flint hides by the ton and 100-ton, and the meat rotting on the ground, and the air whining with flies, and the buzzards and ravens, and the night the horror of snarling and feeding, with the wolves half crazed and wallowing in the carrion. I seen Studebaker wagons with 6 and 8 ox teams headed out for the grounds, not hauling a thing but lead. Just pure galena. Tons of it. On this ground alone, between the Arkansas River and the Concho there, was 8 million carcasses. For that's how many hides reached the railhead. 2 years ago, we pulled out from Griffin for a last hunt. We ransacked the country. 6 weeks. Finally found a herd of 8 animals, and we killed them and come in. They're gone. Every one of them that God ever made is gone as if they'd never been at all. The ragged sparks blew down the wind. The prairie about them lay silent. Beyond the fire it was cold, and the night was clear, and the stars were falling. The old hunter pulled his blanket about him. I wonder if there's other worlds like this, he said, or if this is the only one. When he came upon the bone pickers, he'd been riding 3 days in a country he'd never seen. The plains were sere and burnt-looking, and the small trees black and misshapen, and haunted by ravens, and everywhere the ragged packs of jackal wolves, and the crazed and sun-chalked bones of the vanished herds. He dismounted and led the horse. Here and there within the arc of ribs, a few flat discs of darkened lead, like old medallions of some order of the hunt. In the distance, teams of oxen bore along slowly, and the heavy wagons creaked dryly. Into these barrows the pickers tossed the bones, kicking down the calcined architecture, breaking apart the great frames with axes. The bones clattered in the wagons. They plowed on in the pale dust. He watched them pass, ragged, filthy, the oxen galled and mad-looking. None spoke to him. In the distance he could see a train of wagons moving off to the northeast with great tottering loads of bones, and further to the north other teams of pickers at their work. He mounted and rode on. The bones had been gathered into windrows 10 feet high and hundreds long, or into great conical hills topped with the signs or brands of their owners. He overtook one of the lumbering carts, a boy riding the near-wheel ox and driving with a jerk-line and a jockey stick. 2 youths squatting atop a mound of skulls and pelvic bones leered down at him. Their fires dotted the plain that night, and he sat with his back to the wind and drank from an army canteen and ate a handful of parched corn for his supper. All across those reaches the yammer and yap of the starving wolves relayed, and to the north the silent lightning rigged a broken lyre upon the world's dark rim. The air smelled of rain, but no rain fell, and the creaking bone carts passed in the night like darkened ships, and he could smell the oxen and hear their breath. The sour smell of the bones was everywhere. Toward midnight, a party hailed him as he squatted at his coals. "Come up," he said. They came up out of the dark, sullen wretches dressed in skins. They carried old military guns, save for one who had a buffalo rifle, and they had no coats, and one of them wore green hide boots peeled whole from the hocks of some animal, and the toes gathered shut with leather. "Evening, stranger," called out the eldest child among them. He looked at them. They were 4 and a half-grown boy, and they halted at the edge of the light and arranged themselves there. "Come up," he said. They shuffled forward. 3 of them squatted and 2 stood. "Where's your outfit?" said one. "He ain't out for bones." "You ain't got nary chew tobacco about your clothes, have you?" He shook his head. "Nary drink of whiskey neither, I don't reckon." "He ain't got no whiskey." "Where you headed, mister?" "Are you headed towards Griffin?" He looked them over. "I am," he said. "Going for the whores, I bet you." "He ain't going for the whores. It's full of whores, Griffin is. Hell, he's probably been there more'n you. You been to Griffin, mister?" "Not yet." "Full of whores. Full plumb up. They say you can get clapped a day's ride out when the wind is right. They sit in a tree in front of this here place, and you can look up and see their bloomers. I counted high as 8 in that tree earlier of an evening. Sit up there like coons and smoke cigarettes and holler down at you. It's set up to be the biggest town for sin in all Texas. It's as lively a place for murderers as you'd care to visit. Scrapes with knives, about any kind of meanness you can name." He looked at them from one to the other. He reached and took up a stick and roused the fire with it and put the stick in the flames. "You all like meanness?" he said. "We don't hold with it." "Like to drink whiskey?" "He's just talking. He ain't no whiskey drinker." "Hell, you just now seen him drink it not an hour ago. I seen him puke it back up, too. What's them things around your neck there, mister?" He pulled the aged scapular from his shirt front and looked at it. "It's ears," he said. "It's what?" "Ears." "What kind of ears?" He tugged at the thong and looked down at them. They were perfectly black and hard and dry and of no shape at all. "Humans," he said. "Human ears." "Ain't done it," said the one with the rifle. "Don't you call him a liar, Elrod. He's liable to shoot you." "Let's see them things, mister, if you don't care." He slipped the scapular over his head and handed it across to the boy who'd spoken. They pressed about and felt the strange, dried pendants. "Niggers, ain't it?" they said. "Dock them niggers' ears so they know 'em when they run off." "How many is there, mister?" "I don't know. Used to be near 100. They held the thing up and turned it in the firelight.
Nigger ears, by God.
They ain't niggers.
They ain't?
No.
What are they?
Injuns.
The hell they are. Elrod, you done been told. How come them to be so black as that if they ain't niggers?
They turned that way. They got blacker till they couldn't black no more.
Where'd you get them at? Killed them sons of bitches, didn't you, mister? You been a scout on the prairies, ain't you?
I bought them ears in California off a soldier in a saloon, didn't have no money to drink on. He reached and took the scapular from them.
Shoot, I bet he's been a scout on the prairie, killed every one of them sons of bitches.
The one called Elrod followed the trophies with his chin and sniffed the air.
I don't see what you want with them things, he said. I wouldn't have them.
The others looked at him uneasily.
You don't know where them ears come from. That old boy you bought them off might have said they was Injuns, but that don't make it so.
The man didn't answer.
Them ears could have come off of cannibals or any other kind of foreign nigger. They tell me you can buy the whole heads in New Orleans. Sailors brings them in, and you can buy them for $5 all day long, them heads. Hush, Elrod.
The man sat holding the necklace in his hands.
They wasn't cannibals, he said. They was Apaches. I knowed the man that docked them. Knowed him and rode with him and seen him hung.
Elrod looked at the others and grinned.
Apaches, he said. I bet them old Apaches would give a watermelon a pure fit. What about you all?
The man looked up wearily.
You ain't calling me a liar, are you, son? I ain't your son. How old are you? That's some more of your business.
How old are you?
He's 15. You hush your damn mouth.
He turned to the man.
He don't speak for me, he said.
He's done spoke. I was 15-year-old when I was first shot.
I ain't never been shot.
You ain't 16 yet, neither.
You aim to shoot me?
I aim to try to keep from it.
Come on, Elrod. You ain't gonna shoot nobody. Maybe in the back or them asleep. Elrod, we're gone. I knowed you for what you was when I seen you.
You better go on.
Sit there and talk about shooting somebody. They ain't nobody done it yet.
The other four stood at the limits of the firelight. The youngest of them was casting glances out at the dark sanctuary of the prairie night.
Go on, the man said. They're waiting on you.
He spat into the man's fire and wiped his mouth. Out on the prairie to the north, a train of yoked wagons was passing, and the oxen were pale and silent in the starlight, and the wagons creaked faintly in the distance, and a lantern with a red glass followed them out like an alien eye. This country was filled with violent children orphaned by war. His companions had started back to fetch him, and perhaps this emboldened him the more, and perhaps he said other things to the man, for when they got to the fire, the man had risen to his feet. "You keep him away from me," he said. "I see him back here, I'll kill him." When they had gone, he built up the fire, and caught the horse, and took the hobbles off, and tied it, and saddled it, and then he moved off apart, and spread his blanket, and lay down in the dark. When he woke, there was still no light in the east. The boy was standing by the ashes of the fire, with the rifle in his hand. The horse had snuffed, and now it snuffed again.
"I knowed you'd be hid out," the boy called.
He pushed back the blanket and rolled onto his stomach and cocked the pistol and leveled it at the sky where the clustered stars were burning for eternity. He centered the foresight in the milled groove of the frame strap, and holding the piece so, he swung it through the dark of the trees with both hands to the darker shape of the visitor. "I'm right here," he said. The boy swung with the rifle and fired. "You wouldn't have lived anyway," the man said. It was gray dawn when the others came up. They had no horses. They led the half-grown boy to where the dead youth was lying on his back with his hands composed upon his chest. "We don't want no trouble, mister. We just want to take him with us." "Take him?" "I knowed we'd bury him on this prairie. They come out here from Kentucky, mister. This Tyke and his brother. His mama and daddy both dead. His granddaddy was killed by a lunatic and buried in the woods like a dog. He's never known good fortune in his life, and now he ain't got a soul in this world. Randall, you take a good look at the man that has made you an orphan." The orphan, in his large clothes, holding the old musket with the mended stock, stared at him woodenly. He was maybe 12 years old, and he looked not so much dull-witted as insane. Two of the others were going through the dead boy's pockets. "Where's his rifle at, mister?" The man stood with his hand on his belt. He nodded to where the rifle stood against a tree. They brought it over and presented it to the brother. It was a Sharps .50 caliber, and holding it and the musket, he stood inanely armed, his eyes skittering. One of the older boys handed him the dead boy's hat, and then he turned to the man. "He give $40 for that rifle in Little Rock. You can buy 'em in Griffin for 10. They ain't worth nothing. Randall, you ready to go?" He did not assist as a bearer, for he was too small. When they set out across the prairie with his brother's body carried up on their shoulders, he followed behind carrying the musket and the dead boy's rifle and the dead boy's hat. The man watched them go. Out there was nothing. They were simply bearing the body off over the bone-strewn waste toward a naked horizon. The orphan turned once to look back at him, and then he hurried to catch up. In the afternoon, he rode through the Mackenzie crossing of the Clear Fork of the Brazos River, and he and the horse walked side by side down the twilight toward the town, where in the long red dusk and in the darkness the random aggregate of the lamps formed slowly a false shore of hospice, cradled on the low plain before them. They passed enormous ricks of bones, colossal dikes composed of horned skulls and the crescent ribs, like old ivory bows heaped in the aftermath of some legendary battle, great levees of them curving away over the plain into the night. They entered the town in a light rain falling. The horse nickered and snuffed shyly at the hocks of the other animals standing at stall before the lamp-lit bagnios they passed. Fiddle music issued into the solitary mud street, and lean dogs crossed before them from shadow to shadow. At the end of the town, he led the horse to a rail and tied it among the others, and stepped up the low wooden stairs into the dim light that fell from the doorway there. He looked back a last time at the street and at the random window lights let into the darkness, and at the last pale light in the west and the low dark hills around. Then he pushed open the door and entered. A dimly seething rabble had coagulated within, as if the raw board structure erected for their containment occupied some ultimate sink into which they had gravitated from off the surrounding flatlands. An old man in a Tyrolean costume was shuffling among the rough tables with his hat outheld, while a little girl in a smock cranked a barrel organ, and a bear in a crinoline twirled strangely upon a board stage defined by a row of tallow candles that dripped and sputtered in their pools of grease. He made his way through the crowd to the bar where several men in gaitered shirts were drawing beer or pouring whiskey. Young boys worked behind them, fetching crates of bottles and racks of glasses steaming from the scullery to the rear. The bar was covered with zinc, and he placed his elbows upon it and spun a silver coin before him and slapped it flat. "Speak or forever," said the barman. "A whiskey." "Whiskey it is." He set up a glass and uncorked a bottle and poured perhaps half a gill and took the coin. He stood looking at the whiskey. Then he took his hat off and placed it on the bar and took up the glass and drank it very deliberately and set the empty glass down again. He wiped his mouth and turned around and placed his elbows on the bar behind him. Watching him across the layered smoke in the yellow light was the judge. He was sitting at one of the tables. He wore a round hat with a narrow brim, and he was among every kind of man, herder and bullwhacker and drover and freighter and miner and hunter and soldier and peddler and gambler and drifter and drunkard and thief. And he was among the dregs of the earth in beggary 1,000 years, and he was among the scapegrace scions of eastern dynasties. And in all that motley assemblage, he sat by them, and yet alone, as if he were some other sort of man entire, and he seemed little changed, or none, in all these years. He turned away from those eyes, and stood looking down at the empty tumbler between his fists. When he looked up, the barman was watching him. He raised his forefinger, and the barman brought the whiskey. He paid, he lifted the glass, and drank. There was a mirror along the back bar, but it held only smoke and phantoms. The barrel organ was groaning and creaking, and the bear, with tongue aloll, was revolving heavily on the boards. When he turned, the judge had risen and was speaking with other men. The showman made his way through the throng, shaking the coins in his hat. Garishly clad whores were going out through a door at the rear of the premises, and he watched them, and he watched the bear, and when he looked back across the room, the judge wasn't there. The showman seemed to be in altercation with the man standing at the table. Another man rose. The showman gestured with his hat. One of them pointed toward the bar. He shook his head. Their voices were incoherent in the din. On the boards, the bear was dancing for all that his heart was worth, and the girl cranked the organ handle. And the shadow of the act, which the candlelight constructed upon the wall, might have gone begging for reference in any daylight world. When he looked back, the showman had donned the hat, and he stood with his hands on his hips. One of the men had drawn a long-barreled cavalry pistol from his belt. He turned and leveled the pistol toward the stage. Some dove for the floor. Some reached for their own arms. The owner of the bear stood like a pitchman at a shooting gallery. The shot was thunderous, and in the afterclap, all sound in that room ceased. The bear had been shot through the midsection. He let out a low moan, and he began to dance faster, dancing in silence save for the slap of his great footpads on the planks. Blood was running down his groin. The little girl strapped into the barrel organ stood frozen, the crank at rest on the upswing. The man with the pistol fired again, and the pistol bucked and roared, and the black smoke rolled, and the bear groaned and began to reel drunkenly. He was holding his chest, and a thin foam of blood swung from his jaw, and he began to totter and to cry like a child. And he took a few last steps, dancing, and crashed to the boards. Someone had seized the pistol arm of the man who'd done the shooting, and the gun was waving aloft. The owner of the bear stood stunned, clutching the brim of his old-world hat. "Shot the goddamn bear," said the barman. The little girl had unbuckled herself out of the barrel organ, and it clattered wheezing to the floor. She ran forward and knelt and gathered the great shaggy head up in her arms and began to rock back and forth, sobbing. Most of the men in the room had risen, and they stood in the smoky yellow space with their hands on their sidearms. Whole flocks of whores were scuttling toward the rear, and a woman mounted to the boards and stepped past the bear and held out her hands. "It's all over," she said. "It's all over." "Do you believe it's all over, son?" He turned. The judge was standing at the bar looking down at him. He smiled. He removed his hat. The great pale dome of his skull shone like an enormous phosphorescent egg in the lamplight. "The last of the true. The last of the true. I'd say they're all gone under now, saving me and thee, would you not?" He tried to see past him. That great corpus enshadowed him from all beyond. He could hear the woman announcing the commencement of dancing in the hall to the rear. "And some are not yet born who shall have cause to curse the Dauphin's soul," said the judge. He turned slightly. "Plenty of time for the dance." "I ain't studying no dance." The judge smiled. The Tyrolean and another man were bent over the bear. The girl was sobbing, the front of her dress dark with blood. The judge leaned across the bar and seized a bottle and snapped the cork out of it with his thumb. The cork whined off into the blackness above the lamps like a bullet. He rifled a great drink down his throat and leaned back against the bar. "You're here for the dance," he said. "I got to go." The judge looked aggrieved. "Go?" he said. He nodded. He reached and took hold of his hat where it lay on the bar, but he didn't take it up, and he didn't move. "What man would not be a dancer if he could?" said the judge. "It's a great thing, the dance." The woman was kneeling and had her arm around the little girl. The candles sputtered, and the great hairy mound of the bear, dead in its crinoline, lay like some monster slain in the commission of unnatural acts. The judge poured the tumbler full where it stood empty alongside the hat and nudged it forward. "Drink up," he said. "Drink up. This night thy soul may be required of thee." He looked at the glass. The judge smiled and gestured with the bottle. He took up the glass and drank. The judge watched him. "Was it always your idea," he said, "that if you did not speak, you would not be recognized?" "You see me." The judge ignored this. "I recognized you when I first saw you, and yet you were a disappointment to me, then and now. Even so, at the last, I find you here with me." "I ain't with you." The judge raised his bald brow. "Not?" he said. He looked about him in a puzzled and artful way, and he was a passable thespian. "I never come here hunting you." "What then?" said the judge. "What would I want with you? I come here same reason as any man." "And what reason is that?"
What reason is what?
That these men are here. They come here to have a good time. The judge watched him. He began to point out various men in the room, and to ask if these men were here for a good time, or if indeed they knew why they were here at all.
Everybody don't have to have a reason to be someplace.
That's so, said the judge.
They do not have to have a reason. But order is not set aside because of their indifference.
He regarded the judge warily.
Let me put it this way, said the judge. If it is so that they themselves have no reason, and yet are indeed here, must they not be here by reason of some other? And if this is so, can you guess who that other might be?
No.
Can you?
I know him well. He poured the tumbler full once more, and he took a drink himself from the bottle, and he wiped his mouth and turned to regard the room.
This is an orchestration for an event. For a dance, in fact. The participants will be apprised of their roles at the proper time. For now, it is enough that they have arrived. As the dance is the thing with which we are concerned and contains complete within itself its own arrangement and history and finale, there is no necessity that the dancers contain these things within themselves as well. In any event, the history of all is not the history of each, nor indeed the sum of those histories. And none here can finally comprehend the reason for his presence, for he has no way of knowing even in what the event consists. In fact, were he to know, he might well absent himself. And you can see that that cannot be any part of the plan, if plan there be. He smiled. His great teeth shone. He drank. An event, a ceremony, the orchestration thereof. The overture carries certain marks of decisiveness. It includes the slaying of a large bear. The evening's progress will not appear strange or unusual, even to those who question the rightness of the events so ordered. A ceremony, then. One could well argue that there are not categories of no ceremony, but only ceremonies of greater or lesser degree. And deferring to this argument, we will say that this is a ceremony of a certain magnitude, perhaps more commonly called a ritual. A ritual includes the letting of blood. Rituals which fail in this requirement are but mock rituals. Here, every man knows the false at once, never doubt it. That feeling in the breast that evokes a child's memory of loneliness, such as when the others have gone and only the game is left with its solitary participant. A solitary game without opponent, where only the rules are at hazard. Don't look away. We're not speaking in mysteries. You of all men are no stranger to that feeling, the emptiness and the despair. It is that which we take arms against, is it not? Is not blood the tempering agent and the mortar which bonds? The judge leaned closer. What do you think death is, man? Of whom do we speak when we speak of a man who was and is not? Are these blind riddles, or are they not some part of every man's jurisdiction? What is death if not an agency? And whom does he intend toward? Look at me. I don't like craziness. Nor I. Nor I. Bear with me. Look at them now. Pick a man, any man. That man there, see him? That man, hatless.
You know his opinion of the world. You can read it in his face, in his stance. Yet his complaint that a man's life is no bargain masks the actual case with him, which is that men will not do as he wishes them to, have never done, never will do. That's the way of things with him, and his life is so balked about by difficulty and becomes so altered of its intended architecture that he is little more than a walking hovel, hardly fit to house the human spirit at all. Can he say, such a man, that there is no malign thing set against him? That there is no power and no force and no cause? What manner of heretic could doubt agency and claim it alike? Can he believe that the wreckage of his existence is unentailed? No liens, no creditors? That gods of vengeance and of compassion alike lie sleeping in their crypt, and whether our cries are for an accounting or for the destruction of the ledgers altogether, they must evoke only the same silence, and that it is this silence which will prevail. To whom is he talking, man? Can't you see him? The man was indeed muttering to himself, and peering balefully about the room, wherein it seemed there was no friend to him. A man seeks his own destiny and no other, said the judge. Will or nil? Any man who could discover his own fate and elect, therefore, some opposite course could only come at last to that selfsame reckoning at the same appointed time. For each man's destiny is as large as the world he inhabits, and contains within it all opposites as well. This desert upon which so many have been broken is vast, and calls for largeness of heart, but it is also ultimately empty. It is hard, it is barren. Its very nature is stone. He poured the tumbler full. Drink up, he said. The world goes on. We have dancing nightly, and this night is no exception. The straight and the winding way are one, and now that you are here, what do the years count since last we two met together? Men's memories are uncertain, and the past that was differs little from the past that was not. He took up the tumbler the judge had poured, and he drank and set it down again. He looked at the judge. I've been everywhere, he said. This is just one more place. The judge arched his brow. Did you post witnesses? He said. To report to you on the continuing existence of those places once you'd quit them? That's crazy. Is it? Where is yesterday? Where is Clanton and Brown, and where is the priest? He leaned closer. Where is Shelby, whom you left to the mercies of Elias in the desert? And where is Tate, whom you abandoned in the mountains? Where are the ladies, the fair and tender ladies with whom you danced at the governor's ball when you were a hero, anointed with the blood of the enemies of the republic you'd elected to defend? And where is the fiddler? And where the dance? I guess you can tell me. I tell you this. As war becomes dishonored and its nobility called into question, those honorable men who recognize the sanctity of blood will become excluded from the dance, which is the warrior's right. And thereby will the dance become a false dance, and the dancers false dancers. And yet there will be one there always who is a true dancer. And can you guess who that might be? You ain't nothing. You speak truer than you know. But I will tell you. Only that man who has offered himself entire to the blood of war, who has been to the floor of the pit and seen horror in the round, and learned at last that it speaks to his inmost heart. Only that man can dance. Even a dumb animal can dance. The judge set the bottle on the bar. "Hear me, man," he said. "There is room on the stage for one beast and one alone. All others are destined for a night that is eternal and without name. One by one they will step down into the darkness before the footlamps. Bears that dance, bears that don't." He drifted with the crowd toward the door at the rear. In the anteroom sat men at cards, dim in the smoke. He moved on. A woman was taking chits from the men as they passed through to the shed at the rear of the building. She looked up at him. He had no chit. She directed him to a table where a woman was selling the chits and stuffing the money with a piece of shingle through a narrow slit into an iron strongbox. He paid his dollar and took the stamped brass token and rendered it up at the door and passed through. He found himself in a large hall with a platform for the musicians at one end and a large homemade sheet iron stove at the other. Whole squadrons of whores were working the floor. In their stained peignoirs, in their green stockings and melon-colored drawers, they drifted through the smoky oil light like make-believe wantons, at once childlike and lewd. A dark little dwarf of a whore took his arm and smiled up at him. "I seen you right away," she said. "I always pick the one I want." She led him through a door where an old Mexican woman was handing out towels and candles, and they ascended like refugees of some sordid disaster the darkened, plankboard stairwell to the upper rooms. Lying in the little cubicle with his trousers about his knees, he watched her. He watched her take up her clothes and don them, and he watched her hold the candle to the mirror and study her face there. She turned and looked at him. "Let's go," she said. "I got to go." "Go on." "You can't lay there. Come on, I got to go." He sat up and swung his legs over the edge of the little iron cot and stood and pulled his trousers up and buttoned them and buckled his belt. His hat was on the floor and he picked it up and slapped it against the side of his leg and put it on. "You need to get down there and get you a drink," she said. "You'll be all right." "I'm all right now." He went out. He turned at the end of the hallway and looked back. Then he went down the stairs. She had come to the door. She stood in the hallway holding the candle and brushing her hair back with one hand. And she watched him descend into the dark of the stairwell, and then she pulled the door shut behind her. He stood at the edge of the dance floor. A ring of people had taken the floor and were holding hands and grinning and calling out to one another. A fiddler sat on a stool on the stage, and a man walked up and down calling out the order of the dance and gesturing and stepping in the way he wished them to go. Outside in the darkened lot, groups of wretched Tonkawas stood in the mud, with their faces composed in strange lost portraits within the sashwork of the window lights. The fiddler rose and set the fiddle to his jaw. There was a shout and the music began, and the ring of dancers began to rotate ponderously with a great shuffling. He went out the back. The rain had stopped and the air was cold. He stood in the yard. Stars were falling across the sky, myriad and random, speeding along brief vectors from their origins in night to their destinies in dust and nothingness. Within the hall, the fiddle squealed and the dancers shuffled and stomped. In the street, men were calling for the little girl whose bear was dead, for she was lost. They went among the darkened lots with lanterns and torches calling out to her. He went down the walkboard toward the Jakes. He stood outside listening to the voices fading away, and he looked again at the silent tracks of the stars where they died over the darkened hills. Then he opened the rough board door of the Jakes and stepped in. The judge was seated upon the closet. He was naked, and he rose up smiling, and gathered him in his arms against his immense and terrible flesh, and shot the wooden bar latch home behind him. In the saloon, two men who wanted to buy the hide were looking for the owner of the bear. The bear lay on the stage in an immense pool of blood. All the candles had gone out save one, and it guttered uneasily in its grease like a votive lamp. In the dance hall, a young man had joined the fiddler, and he kept the measure of the music with a pair of spoons which he clapped between his knees. The whores sashayed half naked, some with their breasts exposed. In the mudded dog yard behind the premises, two men went down the boards toward the Jakes. A third man was standing there urinating into the mud. "There's someone in there," the first man said. The man who was relieving himself didn't look up. "I wouldn't go in there if I was you," he said. "Is there somebody in there?" "I wouldn't go in." He hitched himself up and buttoned his trousers and stepped past them and went up the walk toward the lights. The first man watched him go and then opened the door of the Jakes. "Good God Almighty," he said. "What is it?" He didn't answer. He stepped past the other and went back up the walk. The other man stood looking after him. Then he opened the door and looked in. In the saloon, they had rolled the dead bear onto a wagon sheet, and there was a general call for hands. In the anteroom, the tobacco smoke circled the lamps like an evil fog, and the men bid and dealt in a low mutter. There was a lull in the dancing, and a second fiddler took the stage, and the two plucked their strings and turned the little hardwood pegs until they were satisfied. Many among the dancers were staggering drunk through the room, and some had rid themselves of shirts and jackets and stood bare-chested and sweating, even though the room was cold enough to cloud their breath. An enormous whore stood clapping her hands at the bandstand and calling drunkenly for the music. She wore nothing but a pair of men's drawers, and some of her sisters were likewise clad in what appeared to be trophies, hats or pantaloons or blue twill cavalry jackets. As the music soared up, there was a lively cry from all, and a caller stood at the front and called out the dance, and the dancers stomped and hooted and lurched against one another. And they are dancing, the board floors slamming under the jackboots, and the fiddlers grinning hideously over their canted pieces. Towering over them all is the judge, and he is naked, dancing, his small feet lively and quick, and now in double time, and bowing to the ladies, huge and pale and hairless, like an enormous infant. He never sleeps, he says. He says he'll never die. He bows to the fiddlers and sashays backwards and throws back his head and laughs deep in his throat. And he is a great favorite, the judge. He wafts his hat, and the lunar dome of his skull passes palely under the lamps, and he swings about and takes possession of one of the fiddles, and he pirouettes and makes a pass, 2 passes, dancing and fiddling at once. His feet are light and nimble. He never sleeps. He says that he will never die. He dances in light and in shadow, and he is a great favorite. He never sleeps, the judge.
He is dancing, dancing. He says that he will never die. Epilogue. In the dawn, there is a man progressing over the plain by means of holes which he is making in the ground. He uses an implement with two handles, and he chucks it into the hole, and he enkindles the stone in the hole with his steel, hole by hole, striking the fire out of the rock which God has put there. On the plain behind him are the wanderers in search of bones, and those who do not search. And they move haltingly in the light, like mechanisms whose movements are monitored with escapement and palate, so that they appear restrained by a prudence or reflectiveness which has no inner reality. And they cross in their progress one by one that track of holes that runs to the rim of the visible ground, and which seems less the pursuit of some continuance than the verification of a principle, a validation of sequence and causality, as if each round and perfect hole owed its existence to the one before it there on that prairie, upon which are the bones and the gatherers of bones and those who do not gather. He strikes fire in the hole and draws out his steel. Then they all move on again.
The end. You've been listening to Blood Meridian, or The Evening Redness in the West, by Cormac McCarthy, narrated by Richard Poe and directed by Greta Byron.